The doors to the saloon swung wide, and the room's noise fell flat, leaving only the rasp of boots against worn floorboards. The man who entered moved with the measured pace of someone who knew each step by feel alone. His unseeing eyes turned just enough to catch the low lamplight. Without a pause, he cut a line through the gathered crowd, heading for the far corner where I sat alone. I'd been half hidden in shadow, expecting another evening of being ignored. But he stopped at my table and spoke clear enough for every ear to hear. "Miss, I've come a long way to find you, and I aim to ask for your hand. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything." My name is Magnolia Voss, and I was born on the Triple Vive, a spread of good grazing land my father worked until the day he died. I came up with the habits the frontier demands. Rise with the sun, see to your stock before yourself, and measure a neighbor's worth by the help they lend when storms roll in. Folks out here might be poor in coin, but we were rich in the ways that mattered: a warm pot on the stove for anyone passing through hands, ready for a branding day, the Lord's Day, kept without fail. My father believed a name was only as good as the promises it kept, and he raised me to stand by mine. When I was 16, he was gone in accident, they said, out checking cattle near the ridge. After that, everything changed. The preacher took charge of the papers, told me the ranch wasn't mine, that my father had died, owing more than the land was worth. With no kin to speak of, I moved into a small shack on the edge of town. Every inch of it was two small doors I had to duck through, chairs that creaked under my weight, clothes patched until there was more stitch than cloth. Work was scarce, and the kind offered to me was the kind no one else wanted. The town's life turned inward on itself, folks whispering when I passed. Men would stare, some with smirks, some with pity, but none stayed long enough to matter. The newer families came chasing railroad wages and mining shares, bringing with them talk of land deals and speculation. Those of us living off the soil saw their kind change the shape of the place, and not for the better. One autumn evening, the wind carried the faint ring of spurs and the heavy tread of a rider dismounting outside the saloon. I had no reason to think it was anything to do with me until the door swung open and the man with clouded eyes walked straight toward my corner table. He said my name without asking for it, and I knew before the next breath that nothing in my life was going to stay the same. The stranger didn't so much as shift his boots when the words left his mouth, and I wasn't sure anyone in the room breathed. The lamp over the bar flickered shadows moving across faces I'd known all my life. I could hear the hitch in a few breaths, the creak of a chair turning, the faint clink of a glass being set down too hard. The piano player's hands missed their mark and went still. Gideon Nash. His name, still strange in my mind, stood as if anchored to the spot, one hand resting lightly on the back of the empty chair across from me. I didn't have a chance to answer before the bat-wing doors crashed open with a force that rattled the frame. Samuel Morrison stepped in, his black coat flaring out behind him like it caught the wind from a passing train. His boots struck the boards hard, measured and sure. Eyes as sharp as a hawk's swept the room before they fixed on the man standing before me. "What blasphemy is this?" His voice rolled through the saloon like the first crack of thunder before a storm. The hush deepened, and even those who had been sitting near the stove straightened in their chairs. He pointed a long finger at Gideon, the gesture shaking with something between outrage and warning. "Do you even know the nature of what you're proposing?" His words carried the weight of a man used to having them obeyed without question. A few of the ranch hands near the back traded glances uneasy. Morrison had been the town's moral gatekeeper for years, the one who could turn neighbors into outcasts. With a sentence spoken from the pulpit, I felt the old familiar prickle at the base of my neck, the same as every time he'd found a reason to speak against me. Gideon didn't flinch. His head tilted slightly toward the voice, and his reply was steady, each word deliberate. I know exactly who I'm speaking to, and I know exactly who stands before me." His tone wasn't raised yet. It carried across the room, silencing the shifting and whispering that had begun. The preacher's color rose a dark flush creeping up from his collar. No one challenged Samuel Morrison in public, not without paying for it in some way later. The preacher stepped closer, the heels of his boots hitting the boards with a low thud each time. "This woman is a burden to this town. She is a disruption of God's natural order. No man with respect for himself would bind his life to hers." Each word struck like a lash, and though I'd heard variations of them before, they landed with the same old sting. My hands tightened in my lap. I started to rise, already preparing to slip out the side door and into the quiet dark beyond Main Street. But Gideon's hand found mine before I could push away from the table. His grip was firm but not harsh, steady in a way that kept me in my seat. "I've come a long way to find you, Miss Voss," he said quietly. Yet I swear every soul in the room heard it. 300 miles, and I'm not leaving without your answer." The way he said it, plain without flourish, made it sound like something more than a proposal, like a line drawn in the dirt. Morrison's brow furrowed, his voice dropping to a low and dangerous tone. "Who sent you? What game is this?" Before Gideon could speak again, a paper slipped from the inside of his coat. It drifted down to the floor between them, the faint crackle of the folded sheet loud in the stillness. The preacher bent to pick it up, his gloved hand closing over it. As he opened the fold, the light from the nearest lamp caught his face, and I saw his expression change. Confusion, then recognition, then something else entirely. His lips pressed into a thin line as he read whatever was written there. And for the first time since I'd known him, Samuel Morrison looked unsettled. He folded the paper and tucked it into his own coat, straightening to face Gideon again. "Some truths are better left where they lie," he said. His voice had lost some of its earlier fire, but not its edge. Gideon didn't move. "Some lies protect the guilty and crush the innocent," he replied. His head turned slightly toward me. "And this town's been lying about why Magnolia Voss lives alone for a long time." The room felt tighter, the air heavier. A few men at the bar avoided my gaze. Others glanced between one another like they were remembering something best forgotten. I could feel my pulse in my throat. Morrison's eyes cut back to Gideon, his jaw set. "You've come to tear this community apart, stranger. I won't see it happen." The saloon doors opened again, this time without the crash. 3 men stepped inside, dust on their coats, stars pinned to their chests, catching the lamplight. Their leader, a tall man with a weathered face, scanned the room until his eyes found the preacher. "Samuel Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who didn't need to shout. "You're under arrest for conspiracy and fraud. Been tracking you near 2 years. A stir moved through the saloon boots, shifting against the floor, the creak of chairs. Morrison's face paled, though his mouth still tried to shape a denial. "This is a mistake," he said. But the marshal was already drawing a folded document from his coat. "We've got proof you forged inheritance papers and stole land belonging to Miss Magnolia Voss." The words hit harder than any of Morrison's earlier barbs. My breath caught, my mind tripping over itself. Land inheritance. My father had left me nothing, or so I'd been told. The marshal went on speaking to the room, as much as to the man he'd come to arrest. The Triple Vi ranch, largest in the territory, was hers by right when Robert Voss passed 15 years back. Morrison buried the will, kept the profits for himself. The truth settled over the saloon like dust after a stampede. A gasp or two broke the quiet. Morrison's mouth worked, but his words were weaker now. She couldn't handle such responsibility. Look at her. She'd have ruined it all. His voice faltered under the weight of so many eyes now turned against him. I sat, rooted to the chair, my mind turning over every hard year, every cold night, every coin counted twice before spending. All the while, the land my father had built and the stock he'd raised had been working for another man. My hands curled slowly into fists, but I kept my eyes on Morrison. The marshal stepped forward, the folded paper still in his hand. "We've got the signed will right here. Witnessed proper. She's been the rightful owner all along." Morrison took a step back toward the door, his gaze shifting between the marshals and the faces of the men who had once stood in his pews. The wood under his boot creaked as he moved, and for a moment it looked like he might make a break for it. Before anything else could be said, I caught the faint jingle of tack from outside, a sound too close and too steady to belong to a passing rider. Whatever was coming next wasn't going to wait for anyone's readiness. The jingle of tack outside grew sharper until the saloon doors swung wide again, letting in a gust that carried the dry scent of the street. 3 men stepped in their coats, marked with road dust, the polished stars on their vests catching the lamplight. The one in front, tall and broad-shouldered, with a weather-creased face, fixed his gaze on Samuel Morrison. "Preacher Morrison," he said evenly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy and fraud." The words carried without force, but with the kind of weight that made every head turn. The man introduced himself as Marshal Everett Cole. Flanked by 2 deputies, John McCord and Will Harlan, both built for long hours in the saddle. Cole drew a folded paper from his inside pocket and held it out. "We've been after you near 2 years. Got proof you forged inheritance documents and took the Triple Vi Ranch from its rightful heir." My name left his mouth, and the sound of it in that context felt strange, like hearing it for the first time. The preacher's face was tight, his lips working to form a denial. "This is a false charge brought by enemies of this community," he said. But Cole's voice cut in smooth and certain. "We've got the original will signed and witnessed proper. Robert Voss left everything to his daughter. You buried that will and kept the land and profit for yourself." The crowd shifted, a low murmur running along the walls. I sat still, the words settling heavy in my chest. My father's ranch. His herds, the wide acres I'd grown up riding across, hadn't been lost to debt after all. They'd been stolen. Morrison's eyes darted from the marshals to the faces of the men at the bar, the ranch hands near the back. His voice lost some of its bluster, though he tried to hold the shape of authority. "She's unfit for such responsibility." I did what was best. Gideon still stood at my side, silent, his hand resting against the table. The marshal's words kept coming, laying out the scope of what had been taken 15 years of cattle sales, grazing leases, and contracts that should have been mine. Around the room, expressions shifted from curiosity to anger. Some toward Morrison, some toward themselves for having believed him so long. Morrison eased a step back toward the door, the boards creaking under his heel. Before he could take another, the room's lamplight caught 2 figures moving in from the darker corner near the rear wall. They stepped forward, and my breath caught. Tom Garrett and Buck Williams, men I'd known since I was a girl, stood there, older now, their faces lined but familiar. I'd thought them dead in the same accident that took my father. Tom's voice was steady. "Hello, Maggie," he said, using the name no one had called me in years. "We've been waiting a long time to come home." Morrison's face turned a shade paler. "You can't be here," he said sharply. "You drowned in that flood with Robert." Buck stepped closer, his stance solid as stone. "The only thing that died that night was your conscience, Morrison. We saw you push him. We saw you make sure he never got back up." The murmur in the saloon stopped clean, leaving only the faint ticking of the wall clock. Murder spoken out loud and tied to the man who'd worn the collar every Sunday. I felt the floor steady beneath me even as my knees weakened. Tom reached inside his coat and pulled out a worn paper. "Robert wrote this the night before he died. Said he suspected you were stealing from the ranch." Marshal Cole took the letter and gave it a glance before tucking it with the will. "It'll go with the rest of the evidence," he said. Morrison's hands were at his sides, fingers twitching like he might still try for the door. His voice had gone hoarse. "No one will believe the word of wanted men." Gideon's head turned toward me, though his eyes saw nothing. "Robert Voss saved my life 20 years back. Pulled me half frozen from a snowbank and gave me a bed in his own house." His tone held steady, but it carried a thread that reached everyone listening. "When Tom and Buck found me and told me what happened, I knew it was time to see this through." The air in the saloon was close now, heat from the lamps and bodies mixing with something sharper. Anticipation, maybe, or the press of truth finally spoken. Morrison's next step back set the nearest chair rocking. But before he could turn, the marshal's deputies eased to either side, closing the gap. Cole's hand rested near his holster, not yet touching it. "You're coming with us, preacher." The silence stretched Morrison, weighing his chances until the outside wind shifted and brought with it the smell of burning lamp oil. It was faint, but enough to make Marshal Cole glance toward the door. I caught Gideon's hand, tightening on the back of the chair. Morrison's eyes flicked to the open space beyond the threshold, a glint of something dangerous passing over his face. I didn't yet know what he meant to do, but every muscle in the room seemed to brace as if the floor itself was about to shift. Morrison's gaze darted between the marshals, the crowd, and the open doors as if he was measuring the distance to his next move. The faint smell of burning oil that had drifted in grew sharper, curling into the air between us. I saw Marshal Cole's eyes flick toward the doorway, his jaw tightening. Gideon shifted slightly beside me, the leather of his coat brushing my sleeve. Tom and Buck stepped nearer, not blocking the preacher outright, but close enough that any break toward the street would be short-lived. Morrison's voice came low, carrying more edge than strength now. "You think you've got your story straight, but you don't know the half of it." His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling once before he forced them open again. "You bring lies into this town, and you'll all pay for them." His boots creaked as he took another step back, and in the lamplight I caught the glint of something tucked in his palm, small, folded, and metallic. Before anyone could react, Gideon spoke, his voice level. "Tell them, Morrison. Tell them why you made sure Magnolia Voss was kept apart from every soul in this town." The preacher's head snapped toward him, a flash of something fierce in his eyes. "She's dangerous," he said loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. "Stronger than any man here. Could kill with her bare hands." The words cut through the room like a cold wind. I felt the weight of every set of eyes, but this time I didn't look down. Gideon answered without haste. "She was 16 when you made sure no one would hire her, speak to her, or tell her the truth about her father's death." A ripple moved through the onlookers. Some straightened, others glanced away. Morrison's jaw set hard, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He looked toward the side door, maybe judging if he could reach it. And that was when Tom stepped fully into his path. "You killed Robert Voss?" Tom said, his voice even, but carrying. "We saw it. You thought the flood would wash away more than cattle that night." Buck was at his shoulder, his expression set in the same grim certainty. "And you were willing to take his daughter down the same path, if you'd had the chance." The marshal took one slow step closer, the badge on his vest catching the lamplight. "That's enough running, Morrison. You're going to answer for every bit of it." His deputies shifted, closing the space to either side. The preacher's chest rose once sharply, then he eased his hand into his coat pocket, drawing out the small metallic object I'd glimpsed. It was a match safe, and my stomach tightened. He turned it over in his fingers, almost casual. But the intent was plain. The smell of oil from outside was stronger now. "If I go down, this whole place goes with me," he said. The words hung in the air like the pause before a gunshot. The marshal's voice stayed steady. "You'd be adding arson to the list. Think hard before you strike that match." Morrison's gaze swept the room one last time. Then without warning, he dropped the match safe into his coat, lunged toward the nearest table, and sent a lamp crashing to the floor. Flames flared up fast, licking at the boards. Chairs scraped back, voices rose, and the saloon's close air filled with the sharp scent of smoke. Gideon's hand tightened on my arm. "Stay with me," he said, moving us toward the main door. Behind us, Tom and Buck hauled the preacher away from the growing fire, shoving him toward the deputies. The marshal called for water, his voice cutting through the rising clamor. Men rushed for buckets, others stomped at sparks with their boots. But the flames were climbing the wall toward the ceiling beams. Outside, the night air was cool against my face, but it carried the same oily tang. I looked down the street and caught the faint flicker of another firelight where it didn't belong. Morrison's threat came back sharp in my mind. "Marshal," I called over my shoulder. "There's more than one." Cole glanced toward Deputy Harlan. "Go with her. Now." We moved quick along the boardwalk, the pounding of boots behind me. Each step brought the smell stronger until we reached the front of the general store. There he was, Morrison, free of his coat, now an oil can in one hand, its contents spilling across the planks. He froze when he saw us, then straightened, his voice twisting into something between a sneer and a confession. Should have ended with her father. She was too big to make it look like an accident. Harlan's hand went to his sidearm, but I was already moving. The preacher's arm came up, oil sloshing, but I caught his wrist before he could swing it. The can clattered to the boards, its contents pooling dark in the lamplight. He strained against my grip, but years of ranch work had built more strength than he'd reckoned on. I shoved him back toward Harlan, whose grip closed on him with no give. Somewhere behind us, the fire bell began to toll, the sound deep and urgent, rolling out over the rooftops. I knew folks would be rousing, forming bucket lines, and racing to keep the flames from jumping building to building. Harlan jerked his head toward the street. "Go. They'll need you at the creek." I took off at a long stride, the sound of my boots drumming against the packed dirt. The creek ran behind the row of buildings, its bank lined with rocks and brush. If we could cut a channel, the water could make a barrier before the fire reached the next stretch. I dropped to my knees and began yanking rocks free, each one thudding into the mud beside me. Behind me, voices shouted, orders flew, and I could hear the steady rhythm of the bell calling more hands to the fight. By the time the first surge of water spilled into the makeshift trench, my arms burned and my breath came in sharp draws. But the flames that had threatened the next block were slowing. The work wasn't over, but the fire had lost its full hold. I straightened, sweat cooling on my skin, and looked back toward the glow above the rooftops. Somewhere in that crowd, Morrison was still in the marshal's custody, but I knew well enough he wasn't done trying. By the time the last rocks came free, the trench had begun to fill the current, pulling steadily toward the row of buildings that needed saving. The shouts from the street carried over the sound of rushing watermen calling for buckets, women guiding children out of harm's way. The glow above the rooftops was still fierce, but I could see where the flames had slowed, meeting the damp earth and pooling water that blocked their path. My breath came rough, my arms heavy, yet the work wasn't done. I stepped back toward the street, boots sinking into the softened ground along the creek's edge. Gideon was there, guided by Tom Garrett's steady hand. His face was turned toward the sound of the water, listening, as if he could measure the flow by ear alone. "It's holding?" he asked. I nodded before remembering he couldn't see it. "Yes, it's holding." The relief in my voice seemed to ease his stance, but his hand stayed on Tom's arm, steadying himself on the uneven ground. Marshal Cole came up with Will Harlan at his side, both streaked with smoke. "We've got Morrison secured," Cole said, his tone clipped from the effort of keeping the night under control. "He'll be on a wagon to the county seat before sunrise." My gaze drifted down the street past the lines of people passing buckets to where the preacher had been held earlier. He wasn't in sight now, and my stomach tightened. Cole read the change in my expression. "He's under guard." This time he's not slipping past us. The next hour blurred into the rhythm of work, passing buckets, stamping out embers, checking walls and rooftops for stray sparks. When the fire finally gave up its hold, leaving only blackened beams and curling smoke where the saloon and general store had been, the town settled into a weary quiet. Folks stood in small groups, speaking low, some glancing my way before looking quickly elsewhere. I was used to that, but the weight of their stares felt different now. Curiosity mixed with something I couldn't yet name. Gideon found his way to me again, his boots careful on the uneven boards of the walkway. "You saved half this town tonight," he said simply. I didn't answer. The fire might be out, but the preacher's words still lingered, pressing on the back of my mind. Strong enough to kill with my bare hands, that was how he wanted them to remember me. Tom and Buck joined us near the charred remains of the store. Tom's face was marked with soot, but his eyes were sharp. "He's not done," Tom said. "Men like Morrison don't give up their grip without trying every trick they know." Buck nodded, adding, "He'll be thinking of what else he can burn before the law gets him out of here." I glanced toward the marshal, who was speaking with Harlan near the hitching rail. "Then we'll make sure he has no chance to try," I said. The sound of boots on the walkway drew my attention. It was Deputy McCord, a tall man with a lined face that suggested long years in the saddle. "Marshal wants you to know," he said, looking at me. "We found something in his coat. A ring of keys and a folded ledger. Might be important." Cole brought the ledger over himself a few minutes later. He opened it to show lines of figures, names and dates. "This isn't just your ranch," he said. "He's been skimming from freight contracts, church tithes, and grazing leases. There's enough here to bring him down, even without the will." The knowledge settled heavy in my chest. Morrison hadn't just taken from me, he'd taken from nearly everyone in this town. The marshal closed the ledger, tucking it into his coat. "We'll keep this safe until the judge sees it. But Magnolia, this means you'll be called to testify." I nodded, the weight of it already pressing in. Speaking in front of a judge was one thing. Doing it with Morrison watching from across the room was another. Gideon's hand brushed mine briefly, a silent tether in the churn of thoughts. "You'll do it," he said, not as comfort, but as fact. Tom shifted his weight, glancing toward the eastern edge of town, where the horizon was just beginning to pale. "Sun's coming. You should rest while you can." I knew he was right. My body ached in ways I hadn't felt in years, and the smell of smoke clung to my hair and clothes. But as I turned toward the small room I rented above the milliner's shop, I caught sight of the wagon being readied for Morrison's transport. Even at a distance, I could feel the heat of his stare. The driver tightened the traces on the team, the creak of leather loud in the still air. Cole was speaking with Harlan, checking the lock on the irons that bound the preacher's wrists. The light caught on the metal, and for a moment Morrison's gaze met mine across the space. No words passed, but the promise in his eyes was clear enough he wasn't finished. I stepped up onto the walkway, the boards groaning under my weight. The night had given way to that quiet moment before full daylight, when the shadows still linger and the air holds the memory of what happened in the dark. Somewhere behind me, a door closed, and the sound seemed to echo in the emptied street. The morning sun had barely cleared the rooftops when the wagon rolled out its iron wheels, crunching over the packed dirt of Main Street. Morrison sat on the bench between Marshal Cole and Deputy Harlan. Wrist-bound hat brim pulled low enough to shadow his eyes. Even from where I stood near the milliner's steps, I could tell he wasn't beaten, not in the way that mattered. His shoulders were squared, and there was a tightness in his jaw that spoke of plans still turning over in his mind. Tom Garrett joined me on the walkway, his gaze following the wagon until it disappeared past the livery. "He's headed to the county seat, but you'll be seeing him again in court," he said. The words were plain, but the way he said them carried a warning. Buck Williams stepped up on my other side, arms folded across his chest. and he'll try something before that day comes. The street was quieter than usual for that hour, townsfolk moving in smaller clusters, speaking low. The ruins of the saloon and general store still smoked, sending thin gray threads into the sky. A few men were already picking through the blackened beams for anything salvageable. Across the street, Gideon stood with one hand resting on the hitching rail, the other holding the end of Tom's lead rope. His head turned slightly when he heard my boots on the boards. Cole crossed over from the marshal's office, the folded ledger he'd shown me last night, still tucked under his arm. Magnolia, I wired Judge Redmond. He's coming himself for the hearing. Wants your testimony, Tom's and Buck's. He paused, then added, "We'll also be presenting the will and the letter your father wrote. With what's in this ledger, the case is strong. Hearing it laid out like that should have brought relief." But my chest felt tight. When I asked, "4 days," Cole said. "We'll hold Morrison in the county jail until then." Tom let out a low breath. 4 days is a long time for a man like him to stir up trouble even from behind bars. Gideon's voice came from behind me, calm but certain. "Then we keep our eyes open until the gavel falls." He stepped forward, boots steady on the boards, and angled his head toward Cole. "What about the ranch?" Cole shook his head. "Paperwork will take time. Once the judge rules, the title will be restored to you, Magnolia. Until then, I'd advise you to get ready for what comes next." That afternoon, I rode out with Tom and Buck toward the old Triple Vive, the place I hadn't set foot on since my father's funeral. The road wound between stretches of winter-yellow grass and bare cottonwoods, the air sharp with the scent of the season's first frost. As we crested the last rise, the ranch house came into view. Its whitewash weathered, a few boards on the porch rail missing. Beyond it, the barn roof glinted faintly in the sun, and the corral stood empty. We dismounted by the gate, the hinges rusted enough to complain when I pushed it open. My boots crunched on the gravel of the yard, each step stirring a memory. My father's voice calling in the cattle, the sound of harness leather creaking as we readied the wagon for town. The house loomed larger as we drew closer, but it looked smaller than I remembered. Inside, the air was cool and faintly musty. Furniture sat where it had always been, though a layer of dust dulled every surface. I ran my hand along the mantel, leaving a trail through the gray. Tom set about checking the shutters, while Buck made for the kitchen to see if the pump still worked. The sound of water splashing into the basin was answer enough. We walked through each room, noting what would need repair: loose boards in the floor, cracked window panes, the porch steps that sagged under weight. Tom glanced up at the low door frames, a small smile tugging at his mouth. "We'll have to raise these if you're going to live here comfortable," he said. By the time we finished, the sun was low, and the first edge of evening chill had crept into the air. We locked the front door and mounted up, riding back toward town under a sky painted with streaks of gold and crimson. The quiet between us wasn't heavy, more the kind that comes from shared thought. When we reached Main Street, the lamps were being lit one by one. Gideon was waiting outside the boarding house, the glow from the nearest lamp catching on the lines of his face. "How is it?" he asked. "It needs work," I said, "but it's still standing." His smile was small but sure. "So are you." Cole stepped out of the marshal's office. Just then his expression set. "Telegram came in from the county. Morrison's already asked for a change of venue. Judge Redmond refused." He looked at me directly. "Be ready. He'll come at you hard in that courtroom." I nodded, once the sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears. Whatever came in 4 days, I'd face it. But as the night settled over town, I couldn't shake the feeling that Morrison wasn't waiting for the trial to make his next move. The courthouse in the county seat was a 2-story brick building, its front steps worn smooth from years of boots passing over them. By the time we arrived, the street outside was crowded with wagons and saddle horses tied along the hitch rails. Folks had come in from as far as 20 miles to see the hearing, some curious, others eager to hear the truth for themselves. Inside, the air was close and carried the scent of oiled wood and coal smoke from the stove in the corner. Benches lined the walls, everyone filled. Judge Redmond sat high at the front, his black coat buttoned to the throat, spectacles perched low on his nose as he looked over the papers before him. Marshal Cole stood to one side, the folded ledger in hand, while Morrison sat at a table with a hired lawyer, his wrists free for the proceedings, but his posture stiff as a fence post. When the clerk called my name, I stepped to the witness stand, the boards underfoot creaking with each stride. The judge's eyes met mine briefly before he nodded to the clerk. After the oath, Cole stepped forward and began his questions. I spoke of my father's ownership of the 555, of the day I was told it was lost, and of the years since. My words were plain, each one measured the facts laid bare, without anything extra to dress them. Cole showed the court the original will, its ink faded but legible, and the signatures of 2 witnesses still clear. Then he opened the ledger, turning it so the judge could see the columns of figures, cattle sales, lease payments, church collections, all leading back to Morrison's hand. Morrison's lawyer rose when it was his turn. His questions were quick, some meant to rattle me, others to suggest I had misunderstood or misremembered events. I kept my gaze steady, answering each one without letting my voice rise. At one point he asked if I thought my size and strength had made folks uneasy about trusting me with such responsibility. The judge's gavel came down before I could answer. The witness is here to speak on facts, not opinions. Redmond said, his tone sharp enough to still the murmur in the benches. Tom Garrett and Buck Williams each took the stand after me, telling what they'd seen the night my father died. Their accounts matched, and both men swore they'd kept quiet out of fear for their lives after Morrison threatened them. The letter my father had written was read aloud, its words carrying through the room, naming Morrison and warning of the theft he suspected. When Gideon was called, he spoke of the winter storm years ago, how my father had found him half buried in snow and brought him to the ranch. His voice stayed steady as he told the judge about Tom and Buck finding him, about their plea for help in bringing the truth to light. By the time the last witness stepped down, the afternoon sun had shifted its light, slanting through the high windows. Judge Redmond reviewed the papers in front of him, the quiet in the room, deep enough to hear the faint tick of the clock on the back wall. Finally, he looked up. His words were clear. The 555 was mine by right, the will was valid, and Morrison was guilty of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. The gavel struck once sharp against the block. The benches erupted in low conversation, boots scuffing against the floor as folks rose. Cole moved to Morrison's side, the irons going back on his wrists. For the first time, the preacher's eyes dropped his shoulders, losing some of their stiffness. Outside, the light was fading into the gold of late afternoon. Gideon found me near the steps, his hand brushing my arm. "It's done," he said. Tom and Buck stood a little ways off, speaking with Cole. Across the street, a group of townsfolk lingered, watching us with expressions I couldn't yet read. As the judge's carriage rattled past on its way back to the depot, a wind came down the street, carrying with it the first bite of winter. Somewhere in that shifting air, I felt the change settle. What had been taken was coming home. But the work ahead was still waiting, and I knew the next days would decide how it all began. When the gavel fell and Judge Redmond's words settled into the quiet, it felt like the air itself shifted. Outside the courthouse, the late autumn wind carried the smell of wood smoke and dry leaves, a reminder that winter was on its way. The papers that proved the 555 was mine were folded neatly in Marshal Cole's coat, but the weight of them felt as if they were already in my hands. We rode back to town under a sky the color of pewter, the horizon edged in gold where the sun fought through. Gideon sat tall in the saddle beside me, his head tilted toward the sound of the wind through the cottonwoods. Tom and Buck rode ahead, talking low about repairs and the work that would need doing before the snow came. Every hoofbeat brought me closer to the land I hadn't been able to call home in 15 years. The first thing I saw as we crested the hill was the porch rail, weathered and splintered, but still standing. The barn's roof caught the afternoon light, and the corrals waited empty, but sound. Stepping down from my horse, I felt the crunch of gravel under my boots, the boards of the porch giving their familiar creak as I climbed the steps. The key turned in the lock, and for the first time in years, the door swung open to welcome me, not bar me. In the days that followed, the ranch began to breathe again. The dust was swept from the floors, shutters mended, and the pump worked smooth with a little oil. Door frames were raised rails, rebuilt, and the smell of fresh-cut lumber mingled with the scent of coffee in the mornings. The herds would come in spring, but for now, the land was quiet, resting under the pale light of the season. Gideon learned the paths and the fences by touch and sound, his hand brushing the rough wood as he walked. Tom and Buck returned to their old posts, the yard ringing once more with the sound of hammers, saws, and men talking easy between tasks. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now came to the gate offering help, some with mended harness, others with extra nails or sacks of feed. One afternoon, standing at the edge of the porch, I watched the light fade across the pastures and felt the weight of the years slip back, replaced by something steadier. Justice had taken its time, but it had found its way here. The ranch was whole, and so was I. Life on the frontier teaches a person to endure storms, loss long winters, but it also teaches that when you have people willing to stand with you, no one can take your worth away. My father's name was cleared, the land returned, and the truth laid bare for all to see. If you've ever known what it is to wait for the right moment to set something right, you know the quiet that follows when it's done. It's not the noise of victory, but the peace of belonging where you were meant to be. Thank you for listening to my story. If it stirred a memory of your own, I'd be honored if you'd share it, and if you'd like to hear more stories from the Old West, you know where to find me.